Hello, team. Today I want to talk to you guys about Suravasa ruins because we lose it every time. And honestly, I don't think it needs to be that difficult. So, at a glance here, you don't have to memorize all of this, but this is roughly breaking the map down into different sections that I will be using to talk about stuff later. And while this is like kind of the more technical breakdown, and here's this same from a single perspective rather than the full map. The one that you actually should be thinking more about is this one. This is the lanes. So right here, we have the right lane, or if you flip it around, obviously just the inside lane. So I just call it side door because of how it's because it's this section, it's the doors. And then you have the coast lane, which is this entire outside lane. And mid is always just the most direct path to the objective. So in this case, mid is just running it down diagonally here, and then here and here are the two actually relevant parts of the map because they keep you on the outside of the map, which means that you can't be flanked on, and these are the relevant areas of the map to control. You must control one of these two lanes. If you don't, you will lose every time. Now, I'm going to actually walk you guys through some of our samples of maps that we lost when playing Suravasa, and I will also show you examples from Overwatch League and World Cup on relatively comparable compositions, showing you how they interact with this map point. Lesson 1. Do not take the stairs. I repeat, do not take the stairs. I do not care if you are attacking into people on point. I do not care if you are on point defending against people, and we will get to that briefly, but taking these stairs is the worst decision you can make on this map. Here you can see Saudi Arabia literally dumping in 3 ults into 1 ult, and it just doesn't matter because they're getting cooked as they come down these stairs. And notably, Finland can just kite out to either side of the point, and if Saudi Arabia wanted to get any angles here, they would have to branch out way further to the sides of the map and split apart in just ways that just don't work. The same case goes for defensively holding this point, like I said. Here we see that we have Paradox playing on this staircase, and watch how this affects his dynamic between him and Manwë. Paradox cannot afford to kite out, or he will be extremely split. By the same note, he's under heavy pressure from anyone who goes coast, and Manwë now can't afford to kite back on off of the point properly because he breaks LOS on Paradoxed. So now we end up in this awkward situation where we can't actually kite off of the point, but we also failed to suppress the enemy team from pushing onto the point. Do not play the stairs, ever. Do not play the objective. The team who plays the objective on ruins will get dumpstered. You have way more limited options in terms of sightlines, and while there is one sightline that you can take, which is controlling coast to get an off angle, it provides relatively little control over the situation. The team who plays point will usually lose. This was made really obvious in the Finland versus Korea match on this point, as well as this Saudi Arabia versus Finland match. In this one, you actually initially see the brawl happening outside of the point, but then Saudi Arabia begins to push onto the point as Finland kites back. Now, note that Finland doesn't actually take the fight on point, they kite all the way off of the point, and then they actually send Vestola through a teleporter onto the right side to have an off angle, and that alone just seals the deal. The KSA has zero way to handle this situation, and they crumble relatively quickly. The playing the objective is just objectively terrible, pun very intended. Now, in the situation where you do actually end up having to play across the point, I mentioned that there is the one angle option to make this work. So notice how Decay is actually rotating around on this coast side to control it. And then more importantly, Boston does not let the fight happen on point. They actually have someone wrapping around coast, and then importantly, they play through in about 3, 2, 1. Look at this. Decay comes in from the off angle, Lee Jae-gon ints in and dies, but you know, he probably got some attention, and they crush. So even if you're having to play on the point, you don't want to play on the point. It's just crossing it to take the fight elsewhere while setting up angles. So for example, in this VOD where we were going against the former Owl players in our flash ops, we actually managed to do pretty well. We, you know, have beat for the blade, even though they were able to get on our back line, and we were able to capture the point. But then look at what we do from here. We just kind of sit here in the trenches and then get forced back onto the point and then are stuck sitting there. And now the really awkward part is that this actually, we don't even mark coast, which leaves Icy completely free to go onto Paradoxed. So no matter what here, we're going to have a really awkward time kiting back, and it's just going to look ugly no matter how you cut it. And I also really hate that we chose to commit 2 ults here when we already had Paradox die, and they only had 13% cap. I think we absolutely should have just saved those ults. Now, you might be wondering, well, if I can't play the point, where should I be playing? How should I be taking fights? Check out how Mayhem is handling this. They're playing to control the top right lane, and then as soon as Outlaws tries to rotate towards the point to capture, Mayhem bashes into their side. So you actually see a really aggressive swing from kind of that top area near the top of the staircase around into the trenches area, and they play to make sure that they always hold that outside zone of the map and keep it under their control. Here you can actually see Boston do the same thing against the London Spitfire. They are controlling this top zone of the map, and then as soon as they see Spitfire rotating in, they are aggressively swinging to make sure that they catch that backline and pinch them with high pressure and damage. They go like all in. Look how far Smurf is into their backline, and they clean it up easily. And one last example of the same situation. Now, Outlaws actually has a good offensive play in here with their initial engage for playing to control this space, but then as soon as the Mayhem meet them there and the Outlaws are forced back slightly, they follow and they force that section of the map. You cannot be a coward. You need to play for controlling this lane, and you need to play for pressing if people try to rotate to somewhere else. We actually tried to set up a relatively similar hold of our own here versus a team, but it doesn't go too hot because we have really sloppy individual playmaking here. So Ame goes around on an insanely weird flank, and Abstract is playing much too aggressively here in terms of his marking. So we actually end up letting them rotate into coast and onto the point, and we're actually too aggressive with this fight when we could have played it much slower, and we probably would have crushed them almost immediately after this. Versus the former Owl players team, again, we actually managed to get the first pick on Icy, and instead of actually taking the fight, we choose to just rotate towards the point, and this will come back to bite us. Note how they actually rotate around to splinter and put pressure on our backline, like we saw the Owl teams doing with their Zarya, their Lucio, and their BAP, and then their DPS are coming in from this off angle, and our backline, because we're on point, we have zero way of handling this pressure. So they're able to just freely walk on our backline and basically crush us. So maybe we could have set up our angles better, but just playing on point, bad. The last main lesson for this point is just a generic flashpoint thing. Don't make bad situations worse. Here, we weren't ready to have our beat for Manway for matching their flux, and yet we sit here taking the fight for longer and longer and longer and longer, and instead of getting a clean reset, we actually just stagger out for essentially the entire point progress. We actually only get a single fight on this point, because we choose to not clean reset. Do not make a bad situation worse. Now let's talk a little bit about solutions. So this was a fight that we actually set up reasonably well. We played for good control of the top of the point, and then we actually rotated around the edge of the map into the trenches and properly set this up. Unfortunately, Ame isn't playing nearly aggressively not enough on his very greedy off angle, so they actually almost don't look at him at all. And then we have some slightly unfortunate, very rapid death from Manway in the window. He got like one shot for basically 350 HP, so it's kind of whatever. But by the same note, that was a better direction for the setup. And now we'll talk about a little more on the optimal end of how we can set things up. So in theory, our best setup is to start somewhere around here controlling the side doors. This way, if people rotate down main or through the back rooms and towards coast, we can basically just slam into them. And if they go around the side here, we can also just kind of just take the fight here and we have a nice choke and it's probably not a big concern. Either that or we can rotate down towards here and then take the fight as they follow us or just watch as they funnel into the stairs and then we laugh at them. The actual reason that it's better for a team to be taking a fight in this zone here, the back rooms and the trenches, or out here, of course, is because these are much more open spaces where you have more potential for taking aggressive angles. And this kind of is like this wall is really awkward to play around. So for example, if we're slamming into them and the enemy team is, uh, kind of playing around here, well, we're actually able to play in aggressively and then, so like let's say our Sigma presses to here, our BAP has pressed to here, our May is pressing to here, and our Sojourn is pressing up to here, and our Lucio, or let's say our Lucio and May are like kind of down here or something. And now we actually have, you know, a pretty decent little arc going on here compared to the other team. Well, they're at best looking at what someone over here and then the rest of the team over here. But then this is really split because of this structure. If they have someone on the point, then they end up in an awkward situation because, well, they have this little window here, but then that's still barely any angles. And they can't afford to wrap someone through the stairs because the stairs suck and they're so split apart. And if they do wrap someone through the stairs, our Lucio and May should be able to just peel back and deal with them. Because remember, the default plan is if people flank, Sig stops them, he suppresses the front line, BAP supports the Sig, suppresses the front line, Lucio and the nearest DPS deal with it, and then if we also have the other DPS in the area, they deal with it too. So, this is not a concern if they go through the stairs. Now, the moral of the story for you all is Lesson 1, do not take the stairs. Lesson 2, do not play the point. Lesson 3, control the side lane. I recommend that big giant side lane with lots of space instead of playing for that tiny little coast lane, even though that's a good second option if you have to play for that area of the map. 4, don't make a bad situation worse. Don't sit there spending ult on lost fights. Don't sit there staggering things out. Prioritize playing clean. And lastly, step 5, make sure that you are playing for the big wide open spaces on the map with lots of angles instead of just sitting there in a tiny little space that lets them walk on your backline for free. That is all.